say that I shouldn't get all the credit for research on the soldiers. There was an incredible amount done by a man named Tim Denise, who grew up in Penfield, and while he was still living here, he decided to research the soldiers. He wrote for military records, and he looked at regimental records, and he visited cemeteries, and he wrote, depending on where an individual died, he wrote to cemeteries to find out if the person was buried there. And one day I received a box in the mail from him, and it was all of his work. So I was able to take what he had done and build on that, it was wonderful, I have to say, because I'm very interested in it, but it was nice to have that big boost. And then I also had a high school student who's now in college, David Cotterman, he lived in Penfield but was attending Webster, and he spent over 2 years researching in the history room and then going into the city for records on the soldiers as well. And the bug bit him just like it bit me. And there were times when I was ready to close, I had to throw him out and say, I've got to go home. I don't know if, So anyway, I've had help on this. I picked up on what they did in looking in our records to try and bring the soldiers to life. They found the facts and what they did in the service. I wanted to find out what they did when they were in Penfield and what they went on to do and that kind of thing. So I'm probably 1/5 of the way finished with that. So if you wanted to listen to me talk about all of Penfield soldiers, we would be here probably till Tuesday morning. So you're lucky for you, I haven't found them all yet. I'm going to give you some background on Penfield and the Civil War just in general. In 1860, the small town of Penfield, New York, had a population of 3,210 individuals. That included men, women, and children. The population in the 2000 census was 34,645, more than 10 times what it was in 1860. The majority of the male inhabitants were farmers. Today there's a handful or less than a handful of farmers that are left in Penfield. Other occupations at that time included nurserymen, blacksmiths, coopers, shopkeepers, school teachers, masons, carpenters, and many other trades. Some of these occupations are still around today. We've got a lot of school teachers and shopkeepers around. Some of the other occupations you'll only find people engaged in museums, living history museums, or places where they demonstrate trades of the past because they've just gone by the wayside. Residents in early Penfield were independent thinkers, and they held fast to their beliefs. Abolitionists lived as neighbors to Copperheads who were Southern sympathizers. Written activities that we have on the abolitionists and the Underground Railroad activities in Penfield are very scarce, actually almost non-existent. Part of the reason is because of the Copperheads that were here as well, and then what they were doing was against the law. Family histories tell us escaped slaves being hidden away in attics or cupolas of houses, and then at nighttime being taken off to Pulteneyville to be sent across the lake to Canada. Oral church histories include accounts of Underground Railroad activities. One of the best-known abolitionists to everyone was Frederick Douglass, and he lived in Rochester for a large part of his adult life. He was invited to come to Penfield and speak at the early Presbyterian church, which stood on the southwest corner of the Four Corners where the mobile station is today. Somebody invited him here to speak. Other people came out to hear him speak, but other people decided he wasn't going to. So when individuals were congregating in the church, someone stuffed the stovepipe full of rags, which caused the church to become filled with smoke, and everyone had to leave. The people who came to hear Mr. Douglass had to leave the building. He was unable to deliver his speech, and he didn't come back to Penfield to speak again. That's a good example of the diversity of feelings in the town of Penfield. We have that account thanks to little Nellie, who was the editress of the newspaper during the Civil War. She was a young girl of 12 and published the Penfield Extra. So some of the accounts of Civil War activity we have thanks to Little Nellie. Overall, enthusiasm for the Union cause ran strong. In 1861, a group of young men formed the Penfield Junior Zouaves. They didn't go off to war. I think they spent a lot of time drafting their Constitution because we have 3 different copies where they kept redoing it. But 23 signatures were placed in the organizing Constitution, and then in September of 1861, they were invited to attend in uniform a picnic at the Presbyterian Church School. The invitation was issued by the minister. Many of the young men that were in that group went on to later enlist in other units. The papers from the group, their constitutions, the signatures of the men, and the invitation from the early Presbyterian minister are on display along with other artifacts that we have on the Civil War. I thought about bringing some of that down here, and I didn't really want to dismantle the display, and it's only at the back of the library, and the room will be open until 5 o'clock today. So if anyone's interested in, throughout my talk, I'll tell you some of the things we have on display that you can take a look back there and see. The exact number, I thought when I started this, well, I'm going to figure out exactly how many soldiers there were from Penfield, because I would see lists with different names kind of conflicting, and I'm going to figure it out. Well, I have figured it out. 2 sources that I use are Mackintosh's History of Monroe County and Penfield's Past, that was written by Catherine Thompson, who was the past historian. Their lists of names vary. I'm not sure what Catherine Thompson used for her sources, and I don't know what Mackintosh used for his either. And it's not just Penfield's list that can't be compiled with the exact number. I read an article on all of the soldiers in Monroe County, and one of the first introductory sentences was, the exact number of soldiers is unknown. So then I didn't feel so bad not knowing how many we had. Most of the men enlisted in a regiment, served their time, and then mustered out. But some of the others served their time out, re-enlisted in another regiment. Some deserted and re-enlisted under another name because they needed the bounty money they would receive for signing up. Some of them deserted. Some of them were listed as having deserted when they actually were in the hospital or under physician's care, and the person taking the role didn't know that or didn't bother to find it out. So it was difficult to come up with the exact number. After the draft began, some people hired substitutes to take their places. Some of the substitutes were local men, others were procured from other states or even Canada. Men were moved around within a regiment, and then sometimes regiments joined other regiments after they lost a number of individuals. So that also causes some confusion. Some names that are very common appear in even in New York State, like the name Charles Smith. You might find 20 of them across New York State. And it's very hard to determine if it's the one that you're looking for. The exact number of men from Penfield is unknown, but it falls somewhere in the range of 290 to 370. And that doesn't sound like it's that's a pretty big range, but that's the closest I could narrow it down to. Figures in that range are equal to about 10% of the population of the town, or about 20% of the male population, and that's roughly the same percentage that served from all of New York State. So Penfield was right up there doing what the rest of the state was doing. The average age of a soldier on enlistment in the Civil War was 26 years. In Penfield, the average age was 24 years. Other statistics for Penfield soldiers include 43 died in service. At least 18 of them died from sickness or diseases, which included smallpox, scurvy, typhoid, diphtheria, dysentery, and jaundice. 26 of the Penfield soldiers deserted. Some of them re-enlisted in other units. One reportedly joined the Confederate unit, and that was because he was taken prisoner of war. And I think they might have applied a little pressure. If you want to eat, you'll sign up. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he was a bad guy. That might have been what he had to do. 54 were wounded, 33 spent time in at least one prison camp, 6 of them were court-martialed for one thing or another. 14 soldiers that were credited to the town of Penfield were men that were recruited in Kentucky or Tennessee on July 14, 1864. They're listed as colored men who joined for 3 years and received a bounty of $500 each. The sign-up bounty in Penfield was significant. That was a significant amount of money at that time. At least 54 Civil War soldiers are buried in Oakwood Cemetery, 6 in Smith Cemetery, and others from Penfield are in Mount Hope, Elmwood in Carrington, and West Webster. Some Penfield men lie in unmarked graves or marked graves where they fell in battle. Penfield men enlisted in at least 24 different regiments, which included infantry, cavalry, and artillery units, and the U.S. Navy. The majority of enlistments were with the 8th New York Volunteer Cavalry, the 108th New York Volunteer Infantry, and the 140th Volunteer Infantry. And I have to tell you that those are the 3 big units for all of Monroe County. Any write-ups you see about the county, those would be the 3 that most of the men were in. These units had long lists of battles and skirmishes. They all were attached to the Army of the Potomac and served in the area of Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. So they were involved in a lot of battles. And we were lucky enough. We had a man in town, Aristides Francis Church, who was an avid writer. And he was the secretary of the Penfield Veterans Association, which was formed in 1896. And Tide either interviewed or talked to people who knew of the veterans, and he tried to write something about each one of them. And another thing that he did in this book was to write lists of battles and skirmishes of the 8th Cavalry, the 108th, and the 140th Infantry. So he gave me lists of where they were. So I was able to take those lists and put them on a map with push pins and kind of show you how all over the place they were. And I've got that map in here if you'd like to take a look at it later. Mr. Church, in writing that, saw the need to record the story of the deeds of those who fought for the preservation of this great republic. I'm going to now talk about some of the individual soldiers that were from Penfield. And this is far from complete, but this is how much I've gotten to so far. First soldier I want to talk about is Pharcellus William Church. He was a brother of Ty Church, who kept the records of the soldiers. Pharcellus Church is the first signature on the organizing constitution of the Penfield Junior Zouave unit that I talked about earlier. In a second document dated July 23rd, 1861, 16-year-old Pharcellus Church is named the captain of the unit. He was born January 4th, 1845. His parents were William and Emmeline Kennedy Church. He was their oldest child. He grew up in the rural environment of early Penfield near the Four Corners. In fact, his family lived up on the hill by the Catholic Cemetery where Liberty Street comes out. We have an account book that Pharcellus kept from July 26, 1859 through June 17, 1862, and it shows that he earned money hiring out as a farmhand. Entries include payments for planting and hoeing potatoes and corn, for digging potatoes, and for husking corn. In July through December of 1859, he worked 20 days for his uncle Andrew Lincoln, who had a large mill just over the line in Carrington, and he was paid $13.64 for that work. The last entry in his account book is June 17, 1862, 10 days after he enlisted in Company A of the 108th New York Volunteer Infantry. He enlisted as a corporal or was promoted to that position on July 2nd. In a letter to his parents dated July 5, 1862, Pharcellus describes life at the Elmira training camp. He writes that he's doing middling well, as are most of the boys. Middling seems to be a word I've run into before. I think it just means sort of like, you know, just like going along. It's not outstanding, it's not awful, it's just middling. He describes how one of the boys, he only described him with his initials, and I've been able to figure out who it is, H.W., fainted in the heat. And it was almost like he didn't want his parents to share that with anyone because HW might have been embarrassed. Also included with that letter is the schedule of the day at camp. The schedule begins with arriving at 5 a.m. and ends with catch at 9:30 p.m. His letters to his parents, his account book, and the schedule that he has written are part of the display in the history room. Marcellus participated with his unit in the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862. He became ill at Belle Plaine, Virginia, where he died on December 10, 1862 from dysentery. His body was sent home to Penfield. Marcellus Church was buried in Oakwood Cemetery, January 4th, 1863, his 18th birthday. I think Ty might have wanted to enlist, but he was the only remaining son, so his parents probably squelched that. So he wrote about what the other soldiers did, and that we are very lucky that he did that, because now we have something to draw on for some of the information from Penfield soldiers. Anyway, another one of the Penfield juniors that enlisted later was Harmon P. Burroughs. His name was Harmon Peleg Burroughs, and he was born May 10, 1845, to Peleg and Elvira Whitaker Burroughs. The family lived on the southwest corner of Atlantic and Clark Road. His father died in 1853, leaving Mrs. Burroughs to care for Harmon, who was then 8, and his younger sister. Harmon enlisted as a private in the 8th Volunteer Cavalry, September 9, 1861. He was promoted through the ranks to become major. The 8th Cavalry was attached to the Army of the Potomac and later served under General George Custer. Harmon was wounded at Beverly Ford, Virginia in June 1863. His horse was shot down, and as the horse fell, Harmon received a serious saber wound on the top of his head, which knocked him from the horse. This wound resulted in lifelong problems for Major Burroughs. He was at times bedridden because of headache, and the wound was especially sensitive to heat and cold. So when it was especially hot, or a day like today, he would know it, he could feel it in his wound. He was again wounded in June of 1864. He then suffered for 2 months during the war with typhoid fever, but he served until the conclusion of the war and was present when Lee surrendered to Grant. Major Burroughs met and fell in love with a young Virginian girl, Alice Maud Summers. They were married in Annandale, Fairfax County, Virginia, December 30th, 1867, and then they moved west to Illinois, where they purchased a farm and had 6 children. Harmon was active in politics and later became a member of the Illinois State General Assembly for 1 term. In February 1907, Harmon Burroughs died from being kicked in the head by a horse. He seemed to be having problems with horses. He was buried in Illinois, but 15 months later was reinterred at Arlington National Cemetery. And I have to tell you, because his horse was shot, he was in a cavalry unit. They tried to shoot the horses of the cavalrymen because they couldn't work without their horses, and they were certainly a much bigger target than the men. So if the horses were gone, then they couldn't be riding around on them. So I don't like the idea that the horses got shot, but they had no say in it anyway. Another soldier was DeWitt Clinton Hammond, or D.C. Hammond. He and his family lived on the south side of Hermance Road in northeast Penfield. When he enlisted as a private in the 8th Cavalry, on August 22nd, 1862, he was 42 years old. We don't know if he had some very staunch sentiments, or if he needed that enlistment bounty. Some of these things we'll never know. But he left his wife, Amelia, and 6 children when he went off, ranging in age from 4 to 14. In the 1850 census, his occupation was listed as mason, and then in the 1855 state census, it was listed as farmer. And that's not anything that's uncommon. When you start going through the census, you find somebody's one thing, and then there's something else. I think whatever coming and going, and whatever they did last is probably what they told the census taker. The interesting thing about D.C. Hammond is we have copies of and transcriptions of a series of letters from November 30th, 1862 through June 26th, 1864 that he wrote home to his wife. They're very sad to read. One of the main themes is lack of money. Now he's out there fighting for his life and fighting for his country. Most of the letters he's writing about, when he gets paid, he'll send some money home. But he doesn't know when that will be. And I run across that with some other soldiers. They didn't get paid very regularly, so that was a worry that we don't even think about. They had out there sending money home to the families because they weren't getting their pay. And that's another reason some of them might have deserted and enlisted in another unit. You got that sign-up bounty when you signed up. If you weren't getting your pay, you know, that might be one reason. He encourages his wife to keep the children home with her and not put them out to work, which was something that was commonly done to help secure a room and board. He writes about concerns for the children's health and encourages them to be good for their mother. D.C.'s health suffered during this time. He was sick and was sent to a hospital where he helped take care of some of the other patients. And another time, D.C. and several of the other men were given the job of butchering cows. He never regained his health, and he died of what's listed as fever at the Regimental Hospital near Strasburg, Virginia, November 4th, 1864, and was buried at Winchester National Cemetery. Like I said, copies of his letters home to his wife are available in the local history room. You can sit down and take a look at them if you'd like. Another Penfield soldier was Abel Franklin Case. He was born in Penfield, and he was 42 when he enlisted in August of 1862. He enlisted as a private in Company A of the 8th New York Cavalry. He left his wife, Asenath, who had been Asenath Fuller, and children, Hobart, who was 14, Rhoda was 8, and Myron was 6, to serve the Union cause. Prior to his enlistment, he worked for the Gifford and Case Nursery, which was located around Peachtree, where Peachtree Road is today. And the Case family lived on the north side of Penfield Road, west of theirs. And they were members of the Penfield Baptist Church. See, I know different things about these different people. Whatever shows up, you know, that's what I know. So anyway, I know where he went to church. In October of 1863, Abel was promoted to sergeant. He was captured by the rebels at the Battle of Stony Creek, Virginia. Stony Creek Station, Virginia, June 29, 1864, and was sent to Andersonville. He died of scurvy in Andersonville September 11, 1864, and was buried in Andersonville, but his family placed a marker for him in Oakwood Cemetery. And I'm going to get back to him in just a couple of minutes and tell you about a write-up that little Nellie did. Another soldier that was part of the 8th Cavalry and that was captured at that Battle of Stony Creek Station was Edward Follett. He was born in Penfield and was 22 years old when he enlisted in the 8th Cavalry as a bugler in Company A. He'd come from a family of 7 or 8 children and lived on the west side of 5 Mile Line, south of the Four Corners. His father, Abel, was a mason, and Edward was a tinsmith. D.C. Hammond wrote in one of his letters about seeing Edward Follett, and the next time they meet, they will talk about home. We don't have a letter that he wrote after they met, so I don't know if they met up again or if for some reason that letter's missing. Records vary about what happened to Edward after he was captured. He was either sent to Salisbury Prison or to Andersonville. Many either escaped or he was exchanged for other prisoners, but he came out of the war alive. After the war, he moved to Duluth, Minnesota, where he died in 1919, and he's buried in Duluth. In the Penfield Extra, which was little Nellie's paper, she printed an article that mentioned all 3 of the soldiers I just talked about, D.C. Hammond, Abel Case, and Edward Follett. She had received erroneous information, and so her article in the newspaper is incorrect. But it's interesting. It was printed November 24th, 1864, and read as followed. In the headline was "Died in Hospital." We learned from a reliable source that Mr. D.C. Hammond died in the hospital last week. We also hear that 2 abolitionists were shot in cold blood after being taken prisoner for uttering their sentiments. One of them, Mr. Case, told the rebels that this war was just the thing he'd been praying for the last 20 years. The other, Mr. Follett, when he was last home on furlough, said that after he got the traitors wiped out down south, they were coming back to wipe out the copperheads of the north. We trust that in leaving Abraham's kingdom, they have been accepted into Abraham's bosom. He returned to Penfield, where he continued farming until 1879, when he moved to Michigan and became a peach farmer. Jesse died February 3rd, 1919 at Long Beach, California. Well, I think after the war, people began moving over. These men, they were away and they were used to doing. I mean, that's what they were doing during the war, just moving around. And I think coming back home and settling down to farming was difficult for some of them. I think they had to keep going. The other, the youngest Frost brother was Lewis, who was born March 3rd, 1845. And in these letters from Byron and Henry, they encouraged Lewis to write to them more often and tell him not to think of enlisting. Well, on December 26, 1863, he enlisted in the 9th New York Heavy Artillery as a private. And he served with that unit until he was transferred to the 2nd New York Heavy Artillery Unit in June 1865, and then mustered out with his company in September of 1865. Lewis married Elizabeth Hyler, and they had at least 6 children. And they lived in Rochester. Lewis died in Churchville in 1927 and was buried in Oakwood with Elizabeth and 5 of their children. There's one other single individual that I just researched recently, and this is leading me into something else that I find is very interesting with these soldiers. This man's name was Louis Mulner, and he lived on the southeast corner of Sweets Corners in Dublin, where Dublin Road ends. The couple had 3 children, George, Mary, and Helen, and they were all grown at the time that Lewis enlisted. He was in his late 50s when he enlisted in the 13th New York Infantry, January 6, 1862. He was with the regiment at the Battle of Bull Run. According to records written by Ty Church, most of Lewis's service time was spent as a company cook, probably because of his age. In the 1865 census for Penfield, Lewis was living in Penfield with his son George's family. Cynthia was deceased by that time. And then I know on April 26, 1866, Lewis remarried to widow Austin. I don't know what her first name was, that's how she's listed. And then Ty Church records that Lewis remained in Penfield for a few years, removed west where he died. No place or date were given for his death. The reason that I find this interesting is because this unit that he was enlisted with, the 13th New York Infantry, was just, there weren't very many Penfield soldiers in it, but there's a listing in Penfield's past, probably 9 or 10 soldiers. So I thought, I'm going to get off and start researching that group. I can't find any of the others, so I don't know. I've got some more work to do, but anyway, you know what happened to Louis Mulner. I have other soldiers that I've researched, but I think that I've been talking long enough. Anybody's welcome to read about any of these soldiers, and when I finish, then we're going to lock ourselves in here for a week and we'll talk about them. I brought from the history room a map where I've started locating where the soldiers lived in town, and another map where I've located the battles that Ty Church indicated that the 3 main units participated in, and then also a book that was recently published written by Bob Marcotte, Where They Fell. It is on Monroe County Civil War soldiers. Like I told you, we have lots of things on display in the history room, so if you haven't been down to see that, it's open until 5 o'clock today, or we're open other times during the week. So I'm going to ask you at this time if anybody has any questions. Okay, thank you.